Before swords clashed and ships touched foreign shores, there were hands cold from northern winds, but warm with meaning. This is not a tale of conquest, but of quiet exchanges. In the Viking world, a gift was never just a gift. It was memory, promise, and silence bound in one. Tonight, we will drift into a world where rings were oaths, herbs were lullabies, and even a wooden spoon could carry the weight of love. As you listen, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Where you are. Let the past meet your present. If this quiet journey speaks to you, please tap the like button. It helps others find their way here. And if you want to wander through more forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. This story, like every true gift, asks for nothing in return, yet hopes to be remembered. Welcome to Warm Gifts from Cold Hands, silent offerings in the Viking world. In the quiet corners of the Viking world, long before battles roared and legends were etched into runestones, there was a gentler language, one spoken without words, shaped not in steel, but in the giving of simple things. To the Viking heart, a gift was never just an object. It was intention made visible, a gesture, delicate yet firm, a bridge extended over uncertainty, the first breath of a bond or the last sigh of a feud. When a warrior offered a small silver clasp to his former enemy, it did not sparkle for its beauty. It spoke of a past left behind. A clasp meant a closure. Sometimes, a brooch could end more blood than a blade ever could. No shouting, no ceremony, just a hand outstretched. An open palm, carrying more than just metal. It carried risk, trust, perhaps even hope. In longhouses filled with firelight and the scent of damp wool, elders recalled stories of such exchanges. Of warriors who, after years of skirmish, sat on moss-covered stones and traded blades for bread. The gift between them wasn't grand. Maybe it was a ring carved from bone or a thread of finely dyed wool. But it was never meaningless. It was always a message. A man once gave a bead to a woman he barely knew. Not to charm her, but to remember her. Because in the Viking lands, memory was the root of loyalty. And what is a gift, if not a promise remembered? Children, sitting at the edge of these tailies, would hold small stones in their palms, pretending they too had something worth giving. Mothers smiled softly, knowing that someday, those same hands might offer something more. A token of mercy, a whisper of forgiveness. To give was not to lose. It was to declare, I see you. I acknowledge your weight in this world. Even among chieftains, a carved spoon passed between camps could signal an alliance before any word was spoken. A shared meal was a deeper contract than ink. A shared gift, a sacred accord. So, in this first breath of our story, we begin not with war cries, but with quiet hands. We begin with a man who chooses not to strike, but to offer. Who stands before a stone hearth, holding not a sword, but a brooch. His fingers hesitate. Then he steps forward, because sometimes, peace begins with the smallest reach. A gift, a gesture, a beginning. The wind moved low across the valley, brushing gently over stone and soil, whispering along the wooden beams of the longhouse. Morning mist still clung to the earth like an old promise, neither broken nor fulfilled. In this pale light, a young warrior knelt before his chieftain. His shoulders were tense, his breath steady but shallow. In the silence between them, the world seemed to hold its breath. There was no drumbeat, no horn, only the hush of those who watched. Not as spectators, but as witnesses. Because what was about to be placed upon that flat, weather-worn stone was not jewelry. It was an oath made tangible. A ring, forged in silver, shaped with care and memory, was to become the symbol of something older than blood and stronger than fear. Loyalty. In Viking lands, rings were more than adornment, they were pledges. A circle of metal, cold and weighty, yet carrying warmth when passed from palm to palm. When a leader offered a ring, it was not out of generosity alone. It was a request, a question, a vow exchanged without speech. The ring itself bore markings, tiny notches along the inner band, etched by the hands of a smith who knew the name of every ancestor. The silver had been poured long ago, melted over fires that had cooked meat. For 10 generations, it carried smoke and memory, and the quiet strength of tradition. As the chieftain extended his hand, the ring resting in his broad palm, the young man lowered his eyes. Not from shame, but reverence. Around them, elder warriors stood with arms folded, their own rings catching light as the clouds shifted above. Each man there remembered the moment his own wrist had felt the weight of that first offering. This was not a ceremony for conquest, nor a celebration. It was quieter than that, slower, like the growing of moss over stone. The ring was placed on the stone before the young man, a pause. Then the chieftain stepped back. The rest was his choice. To take the ring was to accept more than the metal. It meant to stand when others fell, to sail when others sank, to remember when others forgot. The ring would bind him not only to his leader, but to every other hand that bore a similar mark. The young warrior reached forward, fingers trembling slightly. He touched the metal, cold, real, heavy. His thumb traced the notches before lifting it slowly, almost reluctantly. He slid it onto his finger, awkward at first, unfamiliar. The weight settled. He did not smile. None did, because loyalty was not light. Later, when the fire pit glowed and smoke curled into the sky like silent songs, the ring caught the flicker of flame. It did not shine, it pulsed, as if alive. He turned it with his other hand, over and over again. Already, it began to warm to him. In the days that followed, that ring would see salt water, blood, soil, and snow. It would strike shield rims and be gripped tightly in fists during long nights, but it would never be taken off. Not because of superstition, but because it was no longer a gift. It was a part of him, like bone, like breath, and when he too would become old, his fingers weathered and broad, he would one day pass it on. Not to a son, necessarily, but to another who knelt before stone and silence. Another who dared to wear not just the silver, but the weight of memory. Because in the Viking world, rings were not made to shine. They were made to remember. To endure. To bind. And sometimes to forgive. The room was dim and warm, lit only by the low orange glow of a hearth fire that pulsed like a slow, quiet breath in the corner. Shadows stretched along timber walls, softening the edges of tools and cloaks hung beside the door. The air smelled of wood smoke, aged leather, and something faintly sweet, honey and ash. A bowl of soup simmered gently above the coals, letting out a sound too soft to name. Like the whisper of a distant wave. In this Viking longhouse, the day ended not with speeches or celebration, but with the ritual of eating. Not feasting, not tonight. This was not a hall of drunken song or clashing horns. It was a family gathering, a silence gathering, one where the scraping of wooden spoons and the creak of benches spoke louder than voices. A man placed a small piece of grilled salmon on the carved wooden plate of the one seated beside him. No words exchanged, just the soft slide of fish on the wood. The other man, younger, nodded once, his eyes not meeting the giver's, but lingering a second longer on the gesture. That was enough, because in this house, in this time, sharing food was more than kindness. It was alignment, agreement, a wordless declaration. You belong. Another passed a clay cup filled with honey mead, golden and slow. It caught the light briefly before it disappeared into the dim, held with 2 hands, as if it were sacred. Maybe it was. Sweetness was rare, offered, not poured, sipped, not gulped. A gift in liquid form. Children sat on fur mats near the fire, their cheeks red from the chill of the outside. They held small bowls of fish broth and quietly scooped mouthfuls. too hungry to talk and too tired to disobey. Their mothers sat behind them, hair braided tightly, their backs resting against the wall beams. The same beams that had seen weddings, farewells, oaths, and now this evening. Nothing but chewing, warmth, and glances. In the Viking world, mealtime was a moment of presence. An unspoken count of who had returned, who had stayed, and who had not. The empty spot at the far end of the table was not ignored. It was seen by everyone, but no one looked at it too long. Instead, they passed a spoon, a crust of rye bread, a hunk of cheese left from autumn's last market. Each act was a soft replacement for the words no one wanted to say. One man tore a strip of dried cod and slid it across the table toward an older woman. She nodded, and her fingers, knotted from years of spinning flax, took it without sound. Once, long ago, she had braided his hair before battle. Now they shared fish under firelight, under silence. No thanks spoken, but gratitude thick in the air like steam. Above them, the rafters creaked. Not from movement, but from memory. This place remembered every shared bowl, every quiet toast, every whispered forgiveness passed with a sip of beer. The wood held it. So did the earth beneath their boots. Outside, the wind moved around the walls, but it did not enter. Inside, the only rhythm was the clink of a ladle against a pot, the soft sigh of a child, the long pause before a bite. And still, the fish was passed slowly, deliberately. No one asked for more, but when it arrived, they understood. In Viking culture, generosity was never loud. It arrived as a second helping, a shared fire, a cloak laid over a tired shoulder. It was in the offer, not in the explanation. In the way food touched a plate. In the way fingers lingered just a moment longer when passing a bowl. And in that silence, in that wordless offering, something rare was built. Not just warmth, but belonging. Not just memory. But legacy. Because long after the bread had hardened and the fish bones buried in the soil, the story of this meal would live on in the hearts of those who ate it. And one day, when they passed fish to someone else, they too would say nothing, and everything would be understood. She had hair the color of rusted sun, neither fire nor blood, but something older, something that looked like autumn, had stayed in her scalp. The villagers simply called her the red-haired woman, but her real name hadn't been spoken in a long while. Not because it was forgotten, but because in her world, names were earned again and again, like rings or tokens given with love, taken with time, remembered in silence. Her hands were always busy. In winter, they moved across linen, weaving threads into patterns of sea and knot, stories no one heard aloud, but everyone felt. In summer, they carved soft strokes into bone, shaping combs and clasps with the patience of someone who'd long stopped watching the clock. Time didn't lead her. She led time. In the quiet of her home, one made of wood, moss, and memory, there stood a small box, no larger than a helmet, old, but cared for. Its lid was smooth from the touch of her thumbs, its corners darkened by decades. Inside, not gold, not coins, but hair clasps. Each one was different. Some carved from antler, others shaped from whalebone. Some were plain, others intricate with swirling knots or tiny runes. But they all had one thing in common: none of them belonged to her anymore. Because in Viking life, women gave gifts not with announcements, but with intent. A clasp wasn't just to pin hair. It was to mark something unseen, a beginning, a promise, a held-back truth. When a woman gave a clasp, she did not say what she meant. She didn't have to. Once, long ago, she had sat with another woman beside the hearth, brushing her hair with a comb carved in silence. They had laughed, shared ale, whispered about the stars. When the fire grew low, the red-haired woman took the clasp from her own braid, one carved like a serpent winding through sea waves, and fastened it into the other's hair. No words, only the clasp. And that night, when the longship sailed, The other woman watched from the cliff's edge. That serpent clasp catching the wind. Another clasp, given to a boy with calloused hands and fear in his eyes. He had come to her. For herbs, for a way to stop a fever. She gave him a pouch of dried mint and a small comb shaped like a raven's wing. "Your sister," she whispered, for her hair. She didn't ask if he made it back in time. Once, in spring, she gave a hairpin to a young shield maiden who had never known her mother. "When your braid holds," she said, "so will you." The girl never took it out again, even in battle. Especially in battle. Her box was a chronicle. A map of connections stitched not by blood, but by bone and thread and memory. Each clasp, before it left her hand, held a part of her, an echo, a hope, a farewell. No one ever asked her for a clasp. They simply received one, and they knew. A clasp from her meant you had been seen. Fully, quietly, kindly. And in a world ruled by raids and storms, that kind of seeing was rarer than silver. In time, people began leaving small things on her doorstep. A painted stone, a piece of driftwood, a torn glove. Not as payment, as response, as if to say, "I remember what you gave." She never spoke of these gifts. She simply added them to the box. Some stayed there. Some she passed on, because she didn't believe in possession. She believed in passage. To give a clasp was to send a piece of stillness into a world that barely stopped moving. It was to say, "I know you're fighting. Let this hold something for you." And in the twilight of her years, when her own hair began to gray and her fingers stiffened, she made one last clasp, simpler than the rest. Just a smooth circle with a single carved line through the center. She left it on the WINDOWSILL. No one slider. When a ship returned from a storm, with only one survivor, they said he had a clasp in his coat pocket. Worn, cracked, but carried like it meant something. He never said where it came from. He didn't have to, because some gifts don't explain. They remain. Before the sword was lifted, before the shield was strapped, before the war horns called out across the fjords, there was a quiet moment. A moment not of noise, but of decisions. For many Viking warriors, this moment happened not on the battlefield, but inside a small wooden house in the early hush of dawn, when only the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the roof beams. It was in that silence that something sacred occurred. They chose what to leave behind. A wooden mallet, worn smooth from building boats. A woolen scarf, handspun by a sister with sore fingers. A chipped belt buckle, once gifted in a moment of laughter. These were not weapons. They were fragments of the life they might not return to. And yet, in leaving them behind, warriors carved a path not just through geography, but through memory. Not every Viking went to war with rage in his heart. Some went with love carefully tucked into the corners of their lives. That love was not written in letters or shouted from mountaintops. It was spoken in the small gestures. A knife laid gently on a table, a ring hung from a nail, a stone placed on a windowsill. Each object was a whisper. "If I come back, I will take this again, and if I do not, remember me by it." One warrior, whose name was lost to time but whose story clung to the wind, once tied a single braid of his daughter's hair to the handle of his axe. He left the axe behind. When asked why, he said, "If I carry it and fall, her memory dies. In mud, if I leave it and return, I bring her back to life." Another, younger and unsure, left behind a drinking horn with a crack in it. Not valuable, not beautiful, but his first. It sat on the mantel like a question. Will he return to fill it? And then there were those who left their most cherished items in the most hidden places. Beneath floorboards, inside haylofts, in the folds of a favorite cloak. Not because they were hiding them, but because that's how they hid their fear. To say goodbye without saying goodbye. Often, those who stayed, wives, mothers, Brothers would find these items not immediately, but later, days after the longship had vanished into the sea's horizon. They would discover a tucked-away glove, a carved bead, a bone pendant left by the bedpost. And they would understand. These weren't just belongings, they were anchors. They tethered a soul to a place, to a home, to a story unfinished. Children especially treated them as sacred. One child, barely able to read runes, kept his father's comb under his pillow each night until spring. When asked if it made him sad, he shook his head. "It smells like him," he said. "He'll want it when he's back." Not all warriors returned, of course, and not all objects were reclaimed. Some gathered dust, some were passed down. Others were buried, not in dirt, but in drawers, in hearts, in the folds of silence that only memory knows how to keep. There's a kind of magic in the things we leave behind. They do not age, they do not forget. They wait, and in waiting, they speak of courage, of fear, of love not loud, but lasting. In some villages, entire shelves were dedicated to these objects, not as shrines, but as stories. Anyone could walk in and ask, "Whose is this?" And someone would answer, "That was the man who left on the red morning. That was the brother who never liked fish. That was the boy who always sang before sleep." These tales didn't end with death. They lived in handles, in fabric, in hollowed-out spoons. And perhaps the most beautiful truth of all, sometimes, a warrior would return, open the door, and find the item untouched, exactly where he had left it. And in that moment, the war became real. Not because of what he'd seen, but because of what had waited. A woolen scarf on a table, a belt buckle on a nail, a stone on the windowsill, still warm from the last sunlight of the day. Not all legacies are carved in runestones. Some are left quietly, in corners, and they wait for someone to come back. They say the dead do not speak, but the Vikings believed otherwise. In the echo of waves hitting the shore, in the flicker of firelight inside a burial mound, in the weight of silence that follows the last breath, there was still a conversation to be had, and that conversation required gifts. Not out of obligation, but reverence. Not to bribe the gods, but to honor the journey. When a Viking died, the living did not just mourn, they prepared. Death was not an end, but a passage. And passages required tools. The warrior was not laid to rest with empty hands. No, his sword came too, not for war, but for memory. Not to cut, but to guide. A blade dulled by use, but sharpened by remembrance. The women, too, were not buried in silence. They lay beneath furs with brooches upon their chests, amber beads around their necks, small knives and combs nestled at their sides. Not just tokens of status, but of story. Each object was a sentence, a fragment of a life told through metal and stone. Sometimes, a letter was folded into the folds of a tunic, inked in runes, never signed, left to dissolve into soil or flame. It might say something as simple as, "I will carry your name," or "Your chair remains by the fire," or "You left when the moon was full, I wait for its return." No one read them aloud. They weren't written for the living, the funeral ships, when the sea allowed it, bore their dead with sails loosened and gifts nestled like offerings to another kingdom. The ships themselves became gifts, wood sacrifice to the waves, flame, sacrifice to the sky. On land, the pyres rose like mountains, and from their ashes, bones and beads were gathered, sometimes to bury, sometimes to keep. Children left the simplest of things, a pebble, a feather, a carved toy they once shared. Not because it held value, but because it held touch. It had been touched, and that meant it carried part of them forward. In one village, long since lost to moss and snow, a blacksmith was buried with a hammer, a small broken horseshoe, and a pair of worn gloves. On the gloves, his daughter had stitched one word, always. No one asked what it meant. They didn't need to dot in another tale. A woman named Alfhild was buried with her comb, her mother's ring, and a small sack of seeds. The seeds puzzled the mourners. But her sister whispered. She believed gardens could grow in every world, so they buried the seeds. And every spring, a single green shoot grew from her grave. No one touched it. Gifts weren't always about grandeur. The most sacred were often the most plain: a wooden spoon, a threadbare shawl, a cup with a crack. Things that meant nothing to others and everything to someone. Sometimes, the dead were buried with silence itself. The final act of love was restraint. To leave the grave untouched by wailing. To nod once and walk away. To let the items speak. The act of giving did not end with the burial. Families would return, not to the mound itself, but nearby. They would place a stone, or pour a bit of honey, or sit back against the earth, and say nothing. It was understood. The gift continued. Even when graves were plundered in later centuries, and many were, some items were left untouched. Not out of respect, but fear. The living could feel what the dead had been given. A rusted dagger, a hollow flute, a carved name on a horn. They were not stolen. They were avoided, because some believed, if you take what was meant for the next world, that world comes looking for you. And so the tradition lingered, quietly, in every pine coffin, in every ship set aflame, in every mound that watches the sea. Vikings did not leave their dead unarmed. They did not send them alone. They gave them things. Things that told a story. Things that could be recognized in another life. Things that said, you mattered, you were known, you are still carried. And perhaps most hauntingly, things that said, we will meet again. The stone was not beautiful. It was not polished, nor was it shaped by the hand of a master. It did not sparkle, did not shine. It was rough, uneven, and cool to the touch. A fragment of the earth, taken from the riverside or pulled from the edge of a fjord where the tide whispered forgotten names. But to a child in the Viking world, it meant everything. In the north, where wind howled through narrow valleys and winters wrapped the world in long silence, the first gift given to a child was a stone. Not toys, not swords, a stone, small, enough to carry, heavy enough to remember. This was not a decoration, nor a game. It was a rite. The day a child received their stone was the day they were seen not as a mouth to feed, but as a story to carry. The stone marked the moment when childhood and legacy met. It said, without speaking, you belong, you bear. The stone was chosen with care. It was not picked for its color, but for its shape, flat enough to carve. Upon its surface, a single line would be etched, not a rune, not a name. Just a line, curved or jagged, shallow or deep. A mark that meant nothing to anyone else, but everything to the giver. Often, it was the father. Sometimes the mother. Sometimes a grandparent, old and brittle, who handed over the stone with hands that trembled. They would not explain its meaning. They didn't need to. The child would stare, turn it over in their palms, feel its cool weight, and instinctively understand. I am now part of something older than myself. The stone was kept close, hung on a leather cord around the neck, tied to the waist with twine, slipped into the folds of clothing. As the child grew, the stone remained, worn, darkened by time, smoothed by fingers that touched it each night before sleep. In longhouses, where the firelight flickered against timber walls and stories were told over crackling embers, one could hear elders speaking of their stones. Mine was black as night, one might say, given to me by my father the day he sailed west and did not return. Another would say, mine has a crack down the center, like the fjord near our old home. These stones were not just gifts, they were maps, memories, anchors. Some believed the stone could carry words. If held tightly during times of sorrow, it would absorb the weight. If kissed before battle, it would bring protection. Others thought it connected the bearer to ancestors, the first of their name, the first to hold a shield, the first to light a fire in this cold land. The stone was lineage compressed into mineral, bound by ritual. When a child died, and many did, for life was brittle, the stone was never buried with them. It was passed back to the family, not to be reused, never that, but to be placed among other stones, a pile that told the family story. The higher the pile, the longer the memory. Some kept them in boxes, others buried them beneath the hearth. A few scattered them at sea, letting the waves take what the world could no longer hold. In the spring, when thawed rivers ran fast and the earth softened beneath heavy boots, stones would sometimes be gathered anew. A boy of 10 might receive his younger brother's stone, not to keep, but to carry for a day. Then it was returned, always returned, because each stone had one bearer. One story. There were ceremonies, quiet ones. A family would gather, not in song, but in silence. A hand would reach out. The stone would be passed. The child would look up, eyes wide and uncertain, and the world, just for a second, would seem still, as if even the gods paused to watch. Among the runestones that dotted the hills, carved with names and sagas, there were also smaller ones, plain, no words, just a line or two. Visitors would walk past them, thinking them unmarked. But locals knew. These were the stones of beginnings. One such stone remains today, near the coast where seagulls cry and the grass moves like whispers. It bears a single mark, a loop, like a curl of smoke. No one knows who it belonged to, but children still visit, touching it with reverent fingers, whispering dreams into its shape. And perhaps, somewhere, the story continues. In Viking life, the first stone was never the last. It was the opening line of a long tale, a simple, ancient sentence. You are not alone. You are now part of the weight. The battlefield was not where he remembered her, not amid the clash of metal, the roar of men, or the blood that turned soil dark. No, it was at night, in the stillness between battles, when stars blinked like distant campfires and silence wrapped the tents like mist. That was when he pulled it out, the dried herb wrapped carefully in linen, tucked into the seam of his sword's sheath. Some men carried charms. Others wore bones, teeth, or tiny runestones. But he carried her scent, the herb, lavender, or sometimes juniper, or even a scrap of meadowsweet, was pressed flat, dried with care, and tied with a thread the color of her hair. It came not with grand declarations, but tucked inside a folded cloth, handed over at the threshold with a look that said, "Come back." No words, just that dot. He would press it to his nose on the coldest nights, when the northern wind screamed like ghosts through the camp. The scent had faded, but his memory filled in what time had stolen. He remembered the way her breath caught as she handed it to him, the way her fingers lingered on his palm a moment too long, the way she looked away, not because she didn't love him, but because she did. The other warriors pretended not to see. Every man had something. Some whispered names before sleep. Some carved symbols into the handles of their blades. But him, he had the scent of home wrapped in cloth, hidden in steel. On the night before a great raid, when the air was thick with rain and fate, he sat alone and unwrapped the herb. His hands were calloused, blood still dried under his fingernails. But when he held the herb, he was not a killer. He was a boy in a sunlit field, watching her braid flowers into her hair. He would not take the herb into battle. That was never the point. It stayed in the sheath, close to his weapon, but untouched by blood. It was sacred in its smallness, a line that war could not cross, a whisper in a world of screams. Some nights when sleep did not come, he would press it between his palms and imagine the warmth of her kitchen, the creak of wooden floors, the bubbling pot over the fire, the shape of her back as she moved without speaking. The breath between two people who have said everything and nothing. And when he returned, if he returned, the herb would be with him, faded, crushed, but whole. He would place it in her hand, not to return it, but to say, "It was you who brought me back." Not all warriors survived. Many fell with nothing but steel in their hands. But those who did come home often came bearing strange things: chipped pendants, scratched beads, a dried sprig hidden in a leather pouch. Each one a promise carried across death. In a world of axes and fire, some things were soft, and softness was not weakness. It was memory, it was hope. It was a single dried herb, carried, not for war, but for what waited beyond it. It didn't take gold to bind two souls. No treasure was needed to make a pact among friends, nor silver to carry the weight of gratitude. In the Viking world, the simplest objects bore the deepest meaning, not for what they cost, but for where they came from, who gave them, and why. A small bone button, smooth from years of wear. A length of dyed thread, twisted with care. A hand-carved wooden spoon, none valuable in the market, but priceless in memory. Gifts were exchanged, without fanfare. No trumpets, no declarations. They changed hands at campfires, in the shadow of ships, or beside steaming pots of stew. A man might offer a spoon, not as a replacement, but as an extension of himself. "Use this," it meant. "You are fed where I am fed. You are safe where I am safe." The button might be sewn into a cloak, invisible to the world, but never forgotten by the one who wore it. It held the fabric close, yes, but it also held a story. "He gave this to me before the voyage," someone might say decades later. "He said I'd lose worse things, but to keep this tight." Some gifts were silent agreements. Two warriors sitting back to back after a raid, neither speaking. One simply pushing a strip of cloth into the other's hand. A bond was formed, not spoken, understood. In these gestures there was no debt, no balance sheet. A gift given was not a weight hung around the neck of the receiver. It was trust made physical, a piece of one life handed into another. "Keep this," it meant, "so I'm with you when I'm not." Time passed differently in those days. Long winters blurred into slow springs, and people forgot names, places, years. But they did not forget who gave them a spoon. A piece of thread. A token so small that it could be mistaken for nothing, until one day, when it was needed. Imagine a woman, old now, her fingers curled by time, still wrapping her dinner in the same cloth that had once been a favor from a younger friend. Or a man, tired from years of harvests, still keeping the same bone button in his pocket, though he no longer had the cloak it belonged to. The object had outlived its function. What remained was meaning. In the Viking world, these gifts were quiet, but not forgotten. They were survival in the form of simplicity. A spoon shared at mealtime meant you would not eat alone. A loop of thread tied around the wrist said you would be remembered. These objects became anchors in the flow of memory, proof that someone once reached out, not to ask, but to give. They were not called relics. They were not treated as heirlooms. But when found in burial mounds, archaeologists would wonder what such humble things meant. Why this bead? Why this bit of carved wood? Why place a spoon in a warrior's grave? Because it had once fed him beside a friend. Because it had once been pressed into his palm without a word. Because it had mattered. A gift, once given, did not belong to the giver anymore. It was not a loan, not a test, not a waiting hand. In the Viking world, to give was to let go, fully, silently, without regret. When a hand extended with a token, there was no question. Trailing behind it, will this return to me? The answer was already known. It wouldn't. And that was the point. To give was to carve away a small piece of your life. A button from your cloak, a bead from your necklace, a carved token from your belt, and place it in the hands of someone else, knowing they might walk away forever, perhaps into war, perhaps across the sea, perhaps into the next life. But you gave it anyway, because giving was a kind of farewell. In longhouses, at twilight, you might see two friends exchanging nothing more than a braid of cord. It meant everything. It was not wrapped in ceremony, nor did it need words. One hand reached, the other accepted. And in that brief moment, the bond passed from invisible to physical. A gift made it real. Children learned this early. A stone handed to a sibling meant, "You're safe with me." A shared berry, a piece of bark carved into a face, a broken feather kept in a pouch. They were tokens of trust, not trophies. No child asked for their gift back. To do so would be to unmake the moment it was born from. In the hearts of Viking warriors, the same truth lived. Before setting sail, a man might press an amulet into his wife's palm. She would not ask when he'd return. He would not ask her to keep it clean or safe. The act of giving carried its own completion. The quietest gifts lasted the longest. Years could pass. Seasons would churn and lands would change. And still, somewhere in a wooden chest or beneath a sheepskin blanket, a small token might remain, untouched but not unloved. Not forgotten. Because once something is gifted in silence, it becomes part of the silence. A thread in the fabric of memory. Not every gift was beautiful. Some were crude, hastily made. A shard of bone etched with initials. A coin blackened by fire. A shell from a distant shore, cracked and weathered. But they were all complete. Because the giver never stood waiting for its return. To ask for a gift back was a wound. Not just in pride, but in spirit. The Vikings knew that to pull on. The thread of a memory was to risk unraveling everything around it. They did not believe in ghosts the way stories tell us. But they did believe in echoes. In the trace of a hand once held, a voice once heard. A gift carried those echoes. A simple comb, passed from mother to daughter, became the memory of lullabies and whispered warnings. A woven band worn on them. Wrist became the sound of laughter shared in the snow. To give something was to place a seed in someone else's soil. And what grew there, grief, joy, strength, silence, was no longer yours to tend. So when the question rises, will it come back? The Viking answer was always the same. It already has. In another hand, in another place, in another way, and that was enough.